And now I'm very excited to be introducing tonight's event with Leslie Jamison for her new memoir, Splinters, which is just out this week and is getting all manner of great reviews. It's another kind of love story, per the title. It's the painful story of divorce and of difficult relationships, but it's also a celebration of 3 generations of mother-daughter love that is both deeply affecting and difficult to put down. And I've brought my own advanced copy that I took in the bath and dropped and had to blow dry as an example. Charles Finch, writing in the New York Times, calls this a beautiful, bittersweet memoir. And NPR called Splinters a tribute to the rapturous love Jamison has for her daughter, as well as her attempts to love, or at least accept, the parts of herself that thrive in intensity and turmoil. Leslie Jamison is the author of the New York Times bestsellers The Recovering and The Empathy Exams, the collection of essays Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and the novel The Gin Closet. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and her work has appeared in many publications, including The Atlantic, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, and many other places. And she teaches at Columbia University. Jamison will be in conversation with Kathryn Schulz. Kathryn is a staff writer at The New Yorker. She won a National Magazine Award and a Pulitzer Prize for the really big one, an article about seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest. Her latest book, Lost and Found, grew out of Losing Streak, which was originally published in The New Yorker and which was a stunningly beautiful essay, and later anthologized in the Best American Essays. Her other work has appeared in Best American Science and Nature Writing and various other anthologies, and she lives with her family on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So please help me welcome Leslie Jamison and Kathryn Schulz.
Hello.
Hello. Kathryn, thank you so much for coming out to do this. And thank you. This is a wonderful full house. This bookstore, I was just telling Susan, this bookstore means a lot to me. Not only because I love bookstores, they feel like secular places of worship, but also because this was one of the first bookstores I fell in love with. I was born in Washington, D.C. I lived here till I was 5, and my beloved aunt lived for many years really close. So I would come out and visit her, and we would be in the cafe downstairs, and then I would beg her to buy me a book. And this just felt like one of the most magical places in the world. So it's always, always, always a pleasure to come back, and a particular pleasure to be back here with you. So.
Absolutely and deeply my pleasure. I'm going to let Leslie read here any moment now, because I imagine this book is so recently out, probably most of you have not read it yet. Definitely do. It is, despite the notes of bittersweetness and heartache that you just heard about in these glowing excerpts of these glowing reviews, it's unbelievably funny. It's unbelievably propulsive. The miracle of this book is that Leslie took very not real famous cliffhangers of subjects, things like introspection and parenting an infant, which frankly involves a lot of repetition and doing the same thing again and again and again, and somehow made it into this kind of express train of a journey that is really delightful to be on with her and her incredible intellect and capacious heart. So do you want to just give everyone a sample of it?
I don't want to interrupt what's happening right now. I really like it.
Okay, never mind. Next, I have 45 minutes to praise Leslie's book, which is not nearly enough.
Of course, I was just trying to process that introspection is not a cliffhanger. I'll have to figure out a new career, or at least a new brand. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book, so it doesn't require too much introduction, but I will say that the book is divided into 3 sections. Maybe we can even talk a little bit about how it's structured, but the 3 sections are called Milk, Smoke, and Fever, and each one begins with a prose poem built of Google searches. And I got really interested in these poems as these kind of lyrics as ways into each of these narrative sections because I was starting to think about Google as a kind of confessional booth, a place that we take some of our most private and urgent questions, or simply the questions of our days. And I started to think, God, what would a life look like if it was a tally of the Google searches that had composed it? So I'm going to start by reading the beginning of Milk, but I'm going to start with the lyric that kicks it off. What is the robot owl that makes babies fall asleep? What is the doll with a heartbeat that makes babies fall asleep? What is the name of the $1,000 crib that does everything a mother does? Does the skin shelf above a C-section scar ever go away? Marina Abramovich had how many abortions? Why is the cold moon also called the morning moon? Is a flying ant always the queen trying to start a new colony? What makes the queen ant want to start a new colony? What is the average hourly rate for divorce lawyers in New York City? How will the wolf moon change my life? The baby and I arrived at our sublet with garbage bags full of shampoo and teething crackers, sleeves of instant oatmeal, zippered pajamas with little dangling feet. At a certain point, I'd run out of suitcases. We had diapers patterned with drawings of scrambled eggs and bacon. Why put breakfast on diapers, I might have asked, if there had been another adult in the room. There was not. Outside, it was 19 degrees in the sun. For the next month, we were renting this railroad one-bedroom beside a firehouse. I'd brought raspberries and a travel crib, white Christmas lights to make the dim space glow. Next door, a fireman strutted toward his engine with a chainsaw in one hand and a box of Cheerios in the other. My baby tracked his every move. What was he doing with her cereal? It was only when I told my divorce lawyer she is 13 months old that my voice finally broke. As it turns out, divorce lawyers keep tissues in their offices just like therapists, only not as ready to hand. I know we've got them somewhere, she told me warily, rising from her swivel chair to search, as if to say, we aren't surprised by your tears, but it's not our job to manage them. If I cried for 5 minutes, it would cost me $50. Just over 13 months, I said, wanting to make it seem like we'd stayed married longer than we actually had. Again and again, he told me, our baby is just 1 year old. My best friend said, better to get out now. It did not help to argue with him in my head. It only helped to hold the baby so close that the globe of her belly became the whole world. And even that, well, it cut both ways. Our sublet was long and dark. A friend called it our birth canal. It seemed to be owned by artists. It was not made for a child. The coffee table was just a stylish slab of wood resting on cinder blocks. The biggest piece of art was a large white canvas that looked like a wall hanging on the wall. Sometimes the firemen next door ran their chainsaws for no good reason, but what did I know? Maybe there was a reason for everything. Our nights were full of instant ramen and clementines. My fingers smelled like oranges all winter. Our rooms were lit by the liquid pulsing of red siren lights through the slatted blinds. The kitchen counters were streaked with trails of red velvet batter and little beige buttons of hardened pancake mix. the residue of throwing sugar at a problem. By day, my baby crouched among the heavy art books with her wooden maraca and smacked the translucent pages of a story about a pile of leaves. The willow, the birch, the stray mitten, the lost key, and, at the very bottom, a tiny worm. My baby was gentle with her stuffed moose, nuzzling his patchy brown fur against her cheek. But with her wooden xylophone, she was an Old Testament god. It barely survived her music. We moved out in the middle of flu season. One night I woke up at 4 a.m. with my mouth full of sweet saliva. I stumbled to the bathroom, past the dreaming baby, and knelt in front of the toilet until dawn. When the baby woke, I crawled after her from room to room, then lay on my side on the wooden floor and watched her, sideways. I didn't have the strength to stand, but I didn't want her out of my sight. The things she put in her mouth just blew my mind. All I could do was lie beside her toys, wrapped in a gray blanket, flushed and shivering. She handed me her favorite wooden stick, the one she used to play her rainbow xylophone. She picked up a Cheerio from the floor and lifted it tenderly toward my mouth. I was myself a child of divorce, as they say, as if divorce were apparent. When I was very young, I thought divorce involved a ceremony. The couple moved backward through the choreography of their wedding, starting at the altar, unclasping their hands, and then walking separately down the aisle. I once asked a friend of my parents, "Did you have a nice divorce?" Falling in love with C was not gradual. Falling in love with C was encompassing, consuming, life-expanding. It was like ripping hunks from a loaf of fresh bread and stuffing them in my mouth. In those early days, he was a man frying little discs of sausage on a hot plate in a Paris garret, asking me to marry him, making me laugh so hard I slipped off our red couch, loving the smoked tacos we got from a tiny shack just north of Morro Bay, pointing out backyard chickens from the garage we rented behind a surfer's bachelor pad, putting his hand on my thigh while I drank contrast fluid that tasted like bitter Gatorade before a CT scan to find my burst ovarian cyst, playing the nitty-gritty dirt band on a road trip, putting a cinnamon bear on our rental car dashboard because it was our mascot, our trusty guide, our thing. We had 1,000 things like everyone, but ours were only ours. Who will find them beautiful now? In those early days, he was a man ordering room service steak at the Golden Nugget after we said our vows in a Vegas wedding chapel at midnight. He was a man curled beside me watching our favorite obstacle course program on TV, a man getting my face tattooed on his biceps, a man whispering in my ear at a crowded party. He is still that man. I am still that woman. We have betrayed those tender people, but we still carry them around inside of us wherever we go. The first class I taught that semester of our separation, when my life consisted of sublet hunting, angry texts, and taking care of the baby, or else getting her to childcare, I arrived at class with my pulse loud against my temple, skittery from too much caffeine. My heart was a hive of bees in my chest. My students tucked their hair behind their ears and picked at their cuticles and took turns telling me what they wanted to write about. Labiaplasty, chronic pain, getting caught in an avalanche. They didn't know it, but they were all my children. My beehive heart had enough love for all of them. Once you're finally out of a broken marriage, it feels like you're just dripping with love, or at least it felt that way to me, like it was a heap of bubble bath suds growing larger and larger all around me. I wanted to slather it across the whole world. That was me in my bathtub next to the fire station. Me with my baby taking care of business in every room of our birth canal. She needed to take the spoons out of the spoon rack. She needed to take all the baby jeggings out of the baby jegging drawer. She needed to play her rainbow xylophone like it was a creature that had wronged her, like she was telling me, you better get on your knees, you better get on the floor and start listening. Watching her slam the meat of her tiny palms against the wooden slats, I almost turned to the phantom of her father beside me so we could watch her together, then caught myself. Would every moment of happiness carry this weight tucked inside of it?
Thank you. That was delightful. Since you started at the beginning, let's start at the beginning. I'm going to wear my book critic hat for 1 second and point out something I really love about that opening, which is this railroad apartment right next to the fire station. And you see these firefighters coming and going. And it is subtle and it's beautiful because you are telling us something, which is the house is burning down. This is an emergency, right? And I'm so curious, in a book like this, which is a story about divorce, which is, of course, also a story about marriage, and a story about parenting, which is, of course, also a story about childbirth, and as it happens, because of timing, a story also about the pandemic. How do you land on that beginning? Like, how does a beginning, middle, and end emerge from the chaos of all of life?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the fact of us living next to this firehouse felt, at the time, I don't know if it felt like anything because I had no idea if or when or how I would write into those days that I was living. I think at that moment I was just worried about surviving them. But in retrospect, there are times when you write nonfiction when you think, some version of this feeling when the world has sort of given you something, and there it is, like we were next to a firehouse, and there was a sense of kind of, the firehouse brought in this sense of but simultaneously like constant emergency and constant domesticity. Life was quiet, life was ramen, life was oranges, and also life was sirens. And that is actually really what life felt like in those days, all of those things. And the firehouse always felt to me, it was always where the book began. And it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes I have to write the whole book. I have to write the whole book 4 times before I figure out where it opens. But with this book, I think there was a very acute intertwining of feelings in those firehouse days. The feeling of bewildering loss, certainly this loss, not only of what the marriage had been, but I think so many people know a version of this feeling, like this feeling of grieving what I had hoped it would be, what I had hoped it could become. And that grief felt very present in those days, but was also inextricably bound up on a really moment by moment basis with the intoxication of falling in love with my daughter, continuing to fall in love with my daughter, and feeling this sense of like true joy. Also exhaustion, also sometimes tedium, also all the other things, but truly feeling a sense of deep joy in her presence. And that, more than the events itself, it was that intertwining of kind of loss and joy that I was interested in writing into. And that intertwining of loss and joy felt held by the kind of vessel of that firehouse sublet. We've talked about this before, but it's one of the things that I love most about your book, about Lost and Found, is its interest in not only
I'm not going to let you talk about my book.
I know, but I just have one thing to say about it. Will you just let me say one thing, which is that from the beginning of talking to you about that book, even when it was just a conception born of that beautiful essay, I always loved your interest, not just in losing things and finding things, but in the ampersand, in the kind of what is it like for these things to happen at once. And I think this book was similarly interested in kind of the at onceness of its very, very strong and sometimes contradictory feelings, or at least feelings that felt like vectors pointing in very different directions. So the firehouse always felt like the place where that like double helix of feeling was most kind of fiercely wound. So I knew I wanted to begin there. And from there, the triptych structure, which is essentially like the first section, Milk, tells you how we got to that juncture, tells you sort of the first year of my daughter's life, the marriage that came before, how do we get there? How do we get to the firehouse? The second section, Smoke, takes you forward from the kind of doorway or the threshold of the firehouse, and Fever kind of the world closes in on us again. But beginning a little bit in this like supercharged white hot space in the middle, and then narrating, this is how we came to this point, and then this is where we went.
Last night, in a fit of feeling like I better be a responsible interlocutor for this event, I thought, when did Leslie's book even exactly come out? And let me go check a few facts about it, basic facts. And so I went to Amazon. Like, I couldn't call you up, right? and I was just totally amused and charmed to see that the description on Amazon, and perhaps in the world at large, I don't know, is the first memoir by Leslie Jamison. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, that is technically speaking completely true. But the reason it made me laugh out loud at like 2 a.m. or whatever is that it seems to me that, as true as that might be, the fundamental subject of your work from as long as I've been reading you has been this question of what even is a self, and to access that, what is myself? How do I hold all these contradictory components? Why do I behave as I do? How do I reconcile these parts? How do we make sense of what it feels like to be a human being? So from my perspective, in a certain sense, you've, broadly speaking, always been writing in the land of memoir. And yet it's true, as I thought about it, this is a very different and discrete kind of project. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit, did it feel different, either structurally or as an act of putting it together? Did it feel continuous or like a sort of very distinct break from your past work?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think you're right in a way that, in every way, that the subject of selfhood has long been an obsession of mine. And in fact, the course that I'm teaching this semester at Columbia is called The Self, and it is focused on self-construction as a question of craft. How does one build the I on the page? How does that I contain multitudes? But also thinking in certain ways about self-construction as, yes, the work of the writer of personal narrative, but also the work of everyone, to think of a self as like given rather than made, I think, at least doesn't really align with my experience of having one. So I think, a lot of my work has brought my own story into conversation with other lines of inquiry. So, a lot of my essays bring together personal narrative and cultural history, and sometimes literary reportage, sometimes literary criticism. And this book felt early on, from the very beginning, it was announcing a different set of rhythms and rules and a different texture. And I knew that this book was going to have a kind of distilled, or I knew that I wanted it to have a distilled proximity, like a proximity to a self, myself, my body, my daughter's body, and that every once in a while I would, and I knew also that it was going to take the form of these kind of shards of text that I think of almost as like, they're a paragraph, a couple paragraphs, sometimes a page. I think of them as splinters. The title of the book has a lot of emotional resonances for me, but it's also really a description of the book's form. I think of this book as built of these like splinters of prose. And that was always like, I couldn't have written or really imagined this book without that understanding of its form. And that form always went kind of hand in hand with thinking about this as a text that was going to exist really embedded in the days of my life, and sticking pretty close to my own subjectivity. And every once in a while, I would sometimes experiment with a kind of glancing elsewhere that I do often in essays. So I remember there was a few days where I was writing more deeply into the like truly fascinating history of divorce in America. I was thinking about these hotels in Reno in the 1920s where women would stay for months because Nevada was the only state where you could get a divorce. And all that history is truly not only deeply interesting on a kind of as a moral soil sample of the times, but also just almost novelistic, like, oh, these hotels full of women who want divorces. But I could feel when I turned my gaze that way, it felt that I was turning away from the heat source, and the heat source was for this project was my own experience. And so it felt less like I was like, wow, what I really want to sit down and do today is write about, the garbage bags of stuff I took from my apartment when I was moving somewhere else with my daughter, and more just that whenever I've written, I've always felt like I had to follow the heat of the prose and where it was taking me. And here that heat was like very clear. It just felt like this very clear trail that I was following.
Well, I want to say, first of all, it's so interesting about fragments and splinters, because although I see it and understand it thematically, and I see it at work in the book, it's a really impressive balancing act, because it does not, there's a whole vein of modern writing that feels fragmentary, generally deliberately, and for good or for ill. But this book feels very coherent. It really does have a beginning and a middle and end, and it's going somewhere, as I said, with a lot of momentum. So it's beautifully done. You're right, though, that it stays very close to the bone, very close to the body, very close to your life. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the act of reconstructing your life, because we really do. You're like, we're on a plane in Oslo with you, or we're in that Brooklyn, the railroad apartment with the one Cheerio on the floor. And is that, are you an obsessive documentarian? Are you poaching emails from friends? Is this, I know broadly speaking, the source material is your life, but I mean, I have a terrible autobiographical memory. If you asked me to write about something that happened 3 years ago, I would have to invent half of it.
Yeah, it's I was laughing in part. Well, I was smiling. At first, I was smiling because of thinking about the single Cheerio on the floor. And one thing I will say that's not answering your question, but I will answer your question, is that I was very committed in this book, and kind of joyfully committed to giving my daughter so many of the best lines. And even before she could speak, I was interested in, I didn't have to give them to her really, because she said the things she said and she did the things she did. But just so many of the most extraordinary moments here are hers. And like that moment of her, maybe this is leading into an answer to your question, that moment of her picking up the Cheerio and putting it in my mouth actually just felt like an extraordinary moment of watching a human being come into being right in front of me. This idea that she had begun to see and learn what caregiving was, and that she knew one of the things that she treasured most in this world was Cheerios. So why was that fucking fireman taking them, for starters? But then she sees this one on the floor, and her mom looks like she's kind of in a weird mood, so maybe she wants this thing, and just there's something so unbelievably tender about watching, I don't know, just watching consciousness come to be in that particular way. And I really wanted her to be alive on these pages as not just a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, but as the 1-year-old that she was, the 2-year-old that she was, as you know so well, like they are only ever themselves from the very beginning. They are never like a category of child who is a certain age. Like, and I wanted so much to summon her in her singularity and her particularity. And I, you know, on the subject of particularity, I think there are certain moments that sear into my memory so kind of starkly that even, you know, as somebody who has full respect and humility around the fallibility of memory, I feel like there are certain moments that feel etched, and I write them as these etched moments of memory. But there are other ways in which I kind of, I do try to research my own life in some ways. I take a lot of notes. I'm not like an obsessive, every single day I write in my diary. So I have like a continuous set of notebooks that in an unbroken way chronicles my entire existence. Like I'm thinking about Borges with that parable of like a map that shows everything in the world would have to be as big as the entire world. I do not have the diaristic version of that complete narrative, but I do write a lot of things down, and I certainly wrote a lot of things down during the first couple of years of my daughter's life. I would take notes in little notebooks on my computer, in part because I was really fascinated by her, and in part because the rhythms of being her mother and the kind of consuming nature of being her mother, you know, I wanted, in that state of consumedness, I wanted to not let go of this other part of myself that was interested in like transcribing experience and making sense of experience. And so writing things down felt like a way of staying in touch with that part of me. So I definitely had a lot of stuff to work with, a lot of notes, and I think in part because of my particular writing path that I started when I was young as a writer of fiction, and I grew to love a particular kind of writing that was like very detailed and very lush. And then once I started to write nonfiction, I realized I needed to do certain things in my process to set myself up to do that kind of like lush populated writing, which means, you know, if I'm writing personal narrative, it means like taking a lot of notes. If I'm writing something more reported, it means like noticing a lot of things, because if I want to employ a detail, you know, if I want to say what the lettering said on the church sign, like I better write down what the lettering says on the church sign. So, but I do certain things like, you know, I'll do deep dives through Gmails or text threads, or, I mean, I'm a believer in, you know, what I call personal archives, which is just like the countless kinds of detritus that we leave behind as we move through our daily existences. And I'll go back into the kind of troves of my own personal archives, both to like fact check myself, but also, and maybe more importantly, to like complicate my own stories about my experience in a particular moment. So like there was you know, in my book, The Recovering, I remember I was trying to write about a particular fall when our relationship was falling apart. And in the first draft, I found myself using all these like horrible and unevocative abstractions, like, you know, this growing distance between whatever things, you know, I never want to write that. So I decided to look through my Gmail for those months, and you know, one of the counterintuitively, the thing I found that was actually most useful were these weekly emails that we had gotten from a farm subscription service, like a CSA. They had sent us recipes every week, and that jogged this whole...
Leslie Jamison has archived every email she's ever received. Sorry, go ahead.
I know. Well, it's funny because it's like, instead of actually cooking with any of the vegetables that we received, I was like meticulously drawing on my emails for notes. Because what the recipe emails made me remember was like, oh my God, we got these boxes of produce each week. The reason I signed up for these boxes of produce was really out of a feeling of hope, you know, that maybe we could resuscitate our relationship and this vision of cooking these, you know, elaborate kind of kohlrabi slaw strewn meals. So, you know, whatever the dream was that was embedded in those vegetables. But then I also had this really strong sense memory of like, you know, the squishy cucumber in the back of the crisper that was like what had actually become of those dreams. But the point being that the Gmails were useful in giving me this like very tangible sensory embodiment, not just of like, the rotting cucumber of what was happening in our relationship, but more importantly, the hope that had been there, the hope for these home cooked meals, the hope for these rituals, the hope for this kind of resuscitation. And so there was this this way that the personal archival dive not only gave me a specific that I needed, but it also urged me into a more complicated telling of the emotional trajectory. It was like, okay, it's less poignant to read about things falling apart if you don't also read about, the love that was there to fall apart, the hopes that were there before everything fell apart.
I want to take you back for a minute to something else you shared that everyone here got to hear in your reading. I loved these, you refer to them as prose poems, these kind of Google search epigraphs to each section of your book. They're funny and interesting, and it's impossible not to see yourself in them. And I think you're right to identify them as this very odd little window into the psyche. And, it's interesting. So Google is where we go now to ask questions, to your point, of all possible size, scale, import, triviality, you name it. But that's a relatively recent innovation, of course. And in this book, you're grappling with very large questions about the nature of selfhood, as you always are, but also about how to raise a child, how to be a mother, a daughter, a teacher, a spouse, an ex-wife. and I'm curious, where else do you ask those questions? Like when you sat down to write this book, did you immerse yourself in other memoirs? Did you read, about literary marriages, literary divorces, accounts of parenting? What was feeding you other than your own, this very wonderful trawl through your Gmail and your past?
Yeah, important to have other sources of nutrition besides one's own Gmail archives. This book, there were many things that I was reading and inspired by, but this book definitely has a few what I think of as kind of sacred godmother texts. And I think part of why I think of them as godmother texts is that the book itself is really interested in maternal lines. My relationship with my mother is a big part of the book, the kind of transmission of maternal love through me to my daughter. And sometimes I do feel that way. Sometimes I feel like I'm just almost the juncture or the electrical. I've already lost the engineering metaphor. I'm just a conduit, I guess. I'm a conduit that is taking something that I have received and like passing it on. So the book is interested in kind of matrilineal lines in that way. I'm also interested in friendships as intimacies that, at least for me, feel like they're both reaching toward and in some ways born of the primary intimacy I felt with my mother. And my daughter's godmothers are two of the friends who show up in these pages. And so I think when I think about these texts that I will tell you about that are the kind of godmother texts of this book, I think it's almost like I think about them as participating in this like collectivity of women who are like populating these pages. The two most important texts that I was thinking about were Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights and Susan Taub's novel Divorcing. And Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights is very much a book born of divorce. It's much more oblique in its relationship to divorce as a subject matter, but it's a book that, it's a stunning book that's also built of fragments that turn their gaze in a number of directions. They turn their gaze towards the life of the speaker at the center of the text, but they also turn their gaze towards Billie Holiday and her kind of transcendent music. They turn their gaze towards like a rocky island in Maine. At one point, they turn their gaze toward a kind of a collection of furniture in a Manhattan apartment. And the narrator says, she's remembering the arduous voyage that this furniture has taken from Boston to New York after what she refers to as the change in government. And the change in government is Hardwick's divorce from the poet Robert Lowell. And there's this stunning, but that's about as directly as we see it referenced. And there's this stunning moment at the end of that paragraph where she's reflecting on the fact that this furniture had been ours, that pronoun ours. She says that tea bag of a word steeped in the conditional. And that idea of trying to document the space of like a home, a life, a sense of self, an intimacy, a partnership that's steeped in conditionality, I think is very much one of the dilemmas that's also at the core of this book. Like, when is love unconditional and when is love conditional, and what does it mean for love to be conditional, and what does it mean to kind of take it back, and when is that a sin and when is that necessary? And so there are all these moments that both the ways that Sleepless Nights was written and some of the deep aches that to me are at its core were really sort of spiritual guides for this text. The original draft of this book was actually called Revision Enters the Heart, which is a line from Sleepless Nights. There's a moment where one character says to another, "Don't you see, Marie, that revision can enter the heart like a new love?" And among other things, this book is really thinking about transformation as an ongoing state of being and also a form of intoxication.
I, of course, have 40,000 more questions I would love to ask you, but I feel I'm now starting to deprive the audience of the opportunity. So why don't I stop and let you guys start? And I think we've got a mic here for anyone who wants to come up and ask a question.
I think if you have a question, maybe just walk over to the mic here. Is that right? And then other people can line up behind if others are interested. I think this is for the recording, maybe.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I've misdirected you.
I think it's right over here. Yeah. Okay. Great. Oh, hello.
So I guess I'm sort of wondering how you conceptualize that now, how you think about that now, like what he was saying to you, his response versus your response. I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for that prelude too. It makes me just to echo back, this lovely woman said that she reads my work with her mother, which is like nothing could bring me more joy than to hear that. So thank you for saying it. And then asks about a moment in the book where I narrate a little bit more directly some real moments of anger from C, the character of Mike's husband. And I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, and part of what I'll offer in response is that anger and the role that anger played in the dissolution of this love felt like a necessary emotional note to strike. There was I felt that to understand this story or to move a reader through this story, there needed to be some understanding of why the narrator, me, would leave a marriage. That said, I'll say two things about how I kind of thought about how to write that anger. One is that, when you read a book or a memoir, I think there can be a feeling of having a kind of total experience. And I think it's a good feeling to have. I think it's because you're in the hands of a work that has given you an experience that feels somehow whole. But at the same time, it is only a tiny piece of experience. And in the case of this book, I was very conscious of knowing from the outset that 99.9% of my marriage and what ensued after it ended was going to remain off the page. It was going to remain in life. But in terms of figuring out how to tell the story I needed to tell here, which was really about this kind of simultaneity of like loss and love, what were the tiniest glimpses that I needed to offer, that 0.1% that needed to make it on the page. And that's where that sort of difficult moment partway through, it's trying to speak to that necessity of what fell apart, offering a kind of portal into that. And the second thing I'll say is that actually initially that difficult moment appeared much, much earlier in the book, and that it actually felt like one of the most important structural revisions that I made in the book was just to spend much longer earlier on really narrating what love had felt like in that marriage. And because it was there and it was deep and it was there was a lot in that love that was meaningful to me to represent. And I also took to heart some words of advice from my friend, the great memoirist Mary Carr, who is not on her first memoir. She's written a few. And she said to me, she said, you can't write the pain of divorce by writing what was hard about the divorce. You write the pain of divorce by writing the love that came before. And so I really wanted that love to exist for a reader on the page before some of those difficult moments. And it was an illustration to me of like how things like ordering or like what comes to a reader first, like they make a big difference in a book. Like a book is a journey, and it matters what happens at the beginning of the journey, and it matters kind of what order things happen on the journey. So I'm glad you asked everything you did. Thank you.
Hi, I'm behind this wall for people that can't see me. So thank you for being here tonight. I have a question. So I finished Make It Scream, Make It Burn last night, kind of planning for this. And something I wrote down was that the title really interests me, and I'm going to get to my question. Make It Scream, I kind of thought was like, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. I feel like Make It Scream meant to witness something, to see it. And then Make It Burn was like to inadvertently alter in the act of seeing it. And you talked earlier about your gaze in this book, which I think is a really interesting concept. And I'm curious, like you explore it in your last book, and I think it's somewhat here, this act of gazing at something or seeing it. How do you cope with like that changing, like the reality being different than the gaze you later applied to it? And how do you reconcile that? And like, can it be okay? Yeah.
What an amazing question. I'll start with, I think you're absolutely right that making it burn is a phrase that one of the things that conjures to me is the way that looking at something can not only alter it, but like harm it. And that in that essay collection, one of the moments that's referring to is this crazy thing that happened with the photojournalist Jacob Riis, who wrote in How the Other Half Lives, like these extraordinary documents of New York City tenement life. But there was a moment when he was photographing a tenement, and the flash from his camera actually set off a fire inside the apartment that ended up burning part of it down. And, there is no more kind of explicit metaphor for the ways that somebody who's coming in to document ends up doing some damage. And I think, of course, like my gaze is not only subjective and laden with all kinds of emotional investments and kind of carrying around all the stories I've ever told myself about who I am and why I had to do the things I had to do. And so there's not only the kind of bias of subjectivity, but also the ways that like memory is not a recalling so much as like a reconstruction. It's like making something slightly differently each time it summons it. I guess the two process things I'll say around, I don't know whether it can ever be okay, to answer your question, but I do know that I think to me, the agreement that exists between a writer and their readers in a memoir is not objectivity. It's not, I'm here to present all the different sides of this experience or all the different ways that people remember it. I'm making this piece of art from what I remember and kind of what it looked like from my vantage point. So I think that's kind of the baseline and maybe a difference between memoir and the responsibilities of journalism. But I also think when I was writing this book, I was really conscious of trying to include moments where other people in the book push back in some useful or illuminating way on my sense of things. So there's a moment when my friend Kyle makes this very, I think, insightful and acute observation, although it was also a difficult observation where, I'm sort of asking her, am I feeling some distance from you in the midst of this very intense threshold that I'm at the end of my marriage? And she was very gently said, Leslie, you're kind of always at some intense threshold. Like I'm always with you in some moment of intense transformation. And it's like, and not only did that catalyze a whole set of like interesting questions in my mind at the time, but it also sets off a series of observations in the book about the relationship between identity and transformation, and why this person might be drawn to kind of these crucible threshold moments. So in that way, it's like, that's a moment where her subjectivity is sort of showing you is like allowing a reader a little bit to see around me as a narrator, or see my experiences from like a slightly different point of view. There are moments, I think, also where C is kind of shows up in a moment of dialogue in a way that allows you to see even a glimpse of maybe how he was experiencing something differently than I was. So I think about other characters in memoir as a way that you can kind of complicate at least the version of events that you're getting from the primary narrator. And the very last thing I'll say is that for me, revision, part of maybe why I love that idea of revision entering the heart, is that revision in the process of writing a book is also always an opportunity, and indeed like a summons. It feels like there's an imperative to use revision to kind of complicate my own stories about how things happen. So it's not that every subsequent revision is taking me closer to objectivity. I think that's like an impossible goal for a memoir, but it is taking me hopefully a little bit further away from like the most familiar grooves of kind of, oh, here's the convenient story I've told myself about my relationship with my dad. Here's the convenient story I've told myself about why I got married or why the marriage ended. And when I read through a draft, when I'm in the process of working on a book, I really try to listen for those moments in the prose. I feel like I can hear it in the sentences, like it feels hollow or it feels a little slick somehow when I haven't gotten truthful enough, or I haven't made room for enough layers of truth. And so, but I could never bring all the layers the first time around. Like I could never get them into the first draft. I have to get to them this other way by kind of writing a version, returning to that version, trying to bring more complexity into that version. So I think that's one of the ways that I seek this kind of a more truthful gaze. But it's a beautiful question. And I love that you just finished Make It Scream, Make It Burn, because that collection of essays ends with the birth of my daughter. And that is pretty much where this book begins.
Yes. So it's not to assume that this process of looking back at emails was like this for you, but I'm going to go back. And it's very difficult, like re-traumatizing. Like I get caught in it, and I'm wondering how I dealt with that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is about kind of how to deal with the ways that entering back into prior experience, painful prior experience, can feel emotionally overwhelming and sometimes re-traumatizing, and kind of what my experience with that has been like. Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing to say is like, I think that it's an important, if tricky, skill to develop, like almost a discerning about when is the right time for you to write back into certain experiences. And sometimes I think about it almost like the way that the body has to learn the difference between pain that's telling you that something's wrong, like the pain of being stabbed, where it's like, this shouldn't be happening. Something bad is happening. It should stop. And pain that is more just a part of the body functioning, like a necessary pain. And I think sometimes with writing, it's like you can hit a moment of difficulty in writing that's not a sign of something being wrong. It's just a sign that, and sometimes it's a sign of a subject being truly meaningful and worthwhile. And that's why it feels hard. It's emotionally difficult or it's intellectually difficult, but that all the more reason to show up for it. And I think learning to discern the difference between that sort of difficulty is almost like you're on the right track, and the kind of difficulty that's like, actually, this might be too much, or it's not the right time, or maybe a little bit more time needs to pass, or well, I think so. Some of it is sort of figuring out when's the right time to enter in at all. And then I think the other part of it is exactly what you're sort of starting to summon about going in and coming back, which is to say, figuring out almost like the dosage or the titration, where it's like, maybe it's like half an hour a day or maybe it's an hour, or maybe it's 15 minutes or maybe it's about word count, not minutes, but that sense of how much can I do and trying to figure out what that threshold is and not doing more than that. And then maybe also having some kind of process. My friend Forsyth was just talking to me about this the other day. She's working on a memoir about a time in her life when she was in a cult. And she said that she feels like when she works on it, she goes so deeply back into that part of the past that she has to have a ritual kind of process around coming back into the present. And even just naming that, not that's how everybody needs to do it, but like naming that there is something necessary that needs to happen, that you've gone somewhere and you have to figure out how to bring yourself back, I think is even, there can be something useful in just recognizing that there's a kind of a hurling of self that's happened. And then the self needs to be like reclaimed and brought back into like the doing of dishes and the after school pickup and the living of the day. But it's a wonderful question.
Let's give a round of applause. Thanks, everybody.